The night was quiet in London, but silence rarely lasts long when it comes to the royal family. The streets outside Buckingham Palace looked calm, but inside the halls of power, whispers had already begun. A question echoed through the press, through living rooms, and across social media feeds. What if everything we thought we knew about Prince Harry's children wasn't true? What if the very documents that certified Archie and Lilibet as part of the royal lineage had been tampered with? And what if those irregularities had now dragged Harry into a storm so massive that it left the monarchy with no choice but to cut him off forever? This is where our story begins, not with celebration or ceremony, but with suspicion. For years, Harry and Meghan had positioned themselves as outsiders to the institution, free from palace control. Their narrative was one of independence, a new chapter, a family breaking old traditions. But independence has its price. In their attempt to protect their privacy and shield their children from the spotlight, a fog of secrecy surrounded Archie and Lilibet's births. That fog, at first, was accepted by some as a natural reaction to media pressure. Yet in time, it became something else, a breeding ground for rumors, questions, and now, allegations of forgery. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all started with something small. An overlooked detail in a certificate, a mismatch in the way information was recorded, oddities that would have gone unnoticed if not for the scrutiny of being royal. Birth certificates are not casual paperwork in the world of monarchies. They are historical documents that trace lineage, inheritance, and legitimacy. They are the threads that tie today's royals back to centuries of history. And when those threads show signs of manipulation, the entire tapestry of legacy begins to fray. Imagine the shock, then, when investigators reportedly stumbled upon inconsistencies too glaring to ignore. Seals that looked reprinted, signatures that did not align with official records, dates that seemed off by a margin impossible to explain away. Suddenly, what had been gossip for tabloids transformed into a case for law enforcement. The whispers became louder, the questions sharper. Who was behind these alterations, and why? And most damning of all, was Prince Harry aware? The palace, for its part, responded with silence. There were no grand statements, no public reassurances. That silence was louder than any words could have been, and it fueled the fire. News agencies began to spin the story, each adding layers of tension. Was this a cover-up to hide details of where and when the children were truly born? Was it a desperate attempt to ensure their royal lineage was unquestionable, despite disputes behind the scenes? And if so, who had orchestrated it? This was no longer a question of public relations. This was a legal matter. Forging or tampering with official documents is a crime, regardless of who you are. The idea that a prince, someone who had once been hailed as the people's favorite royal, could be connected to such a scandal was unthinkable. And yet, authorities were moving closer, compelled by evidence that could not be ignored. The very same Harry who had fought for transparency in mental health, who had stood up to the media, now found himself accused of hiding the truth. The middle of this storm is where emotions run high. Harry, the boy who walked behind his mother's coffin, had long tried to define his own identity outside the shadow of the crown. But now his identity as a father was under attack. Every parent understands the instinct to protect their children. Yet, when that instinct collides with the law, with centuries of tradition, and with the trust of a nation, the consequences are devastating. The thought of handcuffs clinking around a prince's wrists was more than symbolic, it was history-shattering. It stripped away the image of untouchable royalty and exposed the humanity and the flaws beneath the crown. The royal family, meanwhile, faced its own crisis. Loyalty to blood versus loyalty to the institution has always been the monarchy's most painful balancing act. King Charles, already managing health struggles and the weight of the crown, could not afford another fracture in the public's trust. Prince William, known for his careful, measured approach, reportedly argued for swift action to preserve the monarchy's reputation. Behind closed doors, the discussions were said to be brutal. Could they continue to stand by Harry if he was truly implicated in something so serious? Or would they have to take the most drastic step imaginable, disowning him, cutting ties completely? For the public, this scandal was more than just another royal headline. It was personal. People who had admired Harry felt betrayed. Others who had long criticized Meghan saw this as vindication. Social media erupted into camps, each side dissecting the story, sharing theories, debating whether this was a witch hunt or a moment of reckoning. Ordinary families, watching from their couches, asked themselves, what would I do if I discovered a loved one had lied about something so fundamental? Would I forgive? Would I turn away? The human element of this scandal resonated beyond the gates of the palace. As the story developed, details grew darker. Reports of secret meetings with lawyers, hushed conversations with aides, Meghan allegedly trying to shield her children from the chaos, while also planning her next move in the media spotlight. Questions about whether the children themselves knew or would one day learn the truth. It was not just Harry's freedom at stake. It was the identity and legacy of Archie and Lilibet. Would they grow up carrying the shadow of this scandal, marked not by their lineage but by controversy? The end of the introduction brings us to the precipice of the story. Imagine the cameras flashing, the sirens wailing, as Harry is taken into custody. The world watches, not believing its eyes, as one of the most famous men on the planet is treated not as a prince, but as a suspect. And as that image burns into the public consciousness, another question rises, heavier than all the rest. Was this truly Harry's doing, or was he merely a scapegoat in a game of power far greater than him? That is where this story will take us. Through whispers and investigations, through royal meetings and courtroom drama, through betrayal and heartbreak. This is not just about birth documents. It is about trust, about identity, about the lengths people will go to protect what matters most. It is about how quickly a royal can fall from grace when the truth, or what looks like the truth, comes crashing down. And by the end, you will be left to decide for yourself. Is this the tragic story of a father fighting for his family, or the shocking downfall of a prince who believed he was untouchable? The air grew heavier as speculation turned into investigation. What began as whispers in tabloids about Meghan and Harry's secrecy over Archie and Lilibet's births now had the sharp edge of law enforcement behind it. Behind palace gates, tension brewed. The monarchy had weathered storms before, scandals of love affairs, abdications, and even divorces, but never had it been forced to confront something as damning as the suggestion that a royal prince tampered with the very documents that secured his children's place in history. This is not just about paperwork. It is about legitimacy. To understand the magnitude, one must appreciate how deeply intertwined bloodlines are with the monarchy's survival. Every title, every inheritance, every place in the line of succession rests on documentation, proof of birth, identity, and parentage. When the paperwork is questioned, the institution itself trembles. And if Prince Harry truly had a hand in altering those documents, it would mean he knowingly threatened not just his own standing, but the crown's credibility. Harry has always been the rebel prince. From youthful missteps splashed across tabloids to his decision to leave royal life, he has made choices that set him apart from his brother William. Yet this time the stakes were unlike anything before. This was not about embarrassing headlines. It was about criminal responsibility. Authorities reportedly scrutinized each detail of the children's documentation, where they were filed, who signed them, how the information aligned with other records. What they found suggested more than mere clerical error. It suggested intent. The thought of Harry being led away by authorities was jarring. It was not just another royal scandal for the gossip columns. It was a constitutional crisis. The monarchy thrives on stability and perception. The moment a prince is accused of forgery, the veil of majesty shatters, leaving behind a man stripped of his immunity, a man like any other, subject to the law. And the royal family, desperate to protect its own survival, would be forced to act swiftly, even if that meant cutting ties with one of their own. At the heart of this lies the human story. Harry is not only a prince, but a father. His world revolves around protecting Archie and Lilibet. Was this desperation to shield them from scrutiny? Was it an attempt to secure their rightful status, even if it meant bending the rules? Or was it something else entirely? A larger plan crafted with Meghan to manipulate perception and protect their brand in America? These questions do not just haunt investigators. They echo in the minds of millions watching from afar. The middle of this introduction brings us face to face with the fractures inside the House of Windsor. King Charles, facing the immense responsibility of preserving the crown, knows the monarchy cannot survive without public trust. William, long seen as the dependable heir, is reportedly furious, seeing Harry's actions as reckless and unforgivable. Courtiers whisper of late-night meetings, of hushed conversations in corridors once filled with portraits of ancestors who endured their own scandals. Yet none were quite like this. Because in this age, the scandal does not stay in courtrooms or corridors. It spreads instantly across the globe, dissected, judged, and immortalized online. The end of the introduction sharpens the cliffhanger. Cameras catch Harry leaving a residence surrounded by police. Helicopters hover above. Reporters shout questions. Flashing bulbs blind him as he is guided toward a waiting vehicle. The image is surreal. The boy who once stood so solemnly beside William at their mother's funeral now being escorted as a suspect. The symbolism is powerful, and it forces the world to confront a chilling possibility. Has the crown itself rejected him? And yet, no one knows the full truth. Was Harry truly complicit, or is he the fall guy in a story too complex for the public eye? Was the forgery deliberate, or a bureaucratic misstep twisted into scandal? As the introduction closes, one thing is certain. This is not just a story about royal paperwork. It is about betrayal, identity, and the devastating cost of secrets when they collide with centuries-old traditions. From the moment Harry and Meghan introduced themselves to the world as a couple, their story was framed as a modern fairy tale. Here was the rebellious prince, long known for his aversion to palace traditions, finding love with an American actress who embodied independence, glamour, and charisma. Their wedding in Windsor was watched by millions across the globe. Every smile, every whispered vow, every tear that glistened in the chapel light seemed to mark the beginning of a new chapter not only for Harry, but for the monarchy itself. The message was clear. This was not the old guard of stiff tradition. This was a new royal family, relatable, diverse, and global. Yet beneath the surface of this image, cracks were already forming. Harry's decision to distance himself from the press, a move rooted in painful memories of his mother's treatment, became a constant tug-of-war. Meghan's relationship with the British media soured almost immediately, leading to a siege of criticism and defense. By the time Archie was born, the once celebrated couple had transformed into lightning rods for controversy. Their insistence on privacy became both their shield and their burden. For centuries, royal births had been matters of public record, celebrated with announcements, official photographs, and open acknowledgement of lineage. But Archie's birth was different. Instead of the traditional hospital steps photographs that had defined generations of royal newborns, Meghan and Harry chose secrecy. They delayed announcements, withheld details, and released carefully curated images only on their terms. Supporters praised their decision to reclaim control, but critics smelled evasion. And in that climate of mistrust, every inconsistency became magnified. When Archie's birth certificate was eventually released, eagle-eyed observers noticed alterations. The Duchess's name, initially listed one way, was later changed. The explanation from palace officials, that it was an administrative adjustment, satisfied few. Suspicion began to swirl. By the time Lilibet was born in America, the secrecy deepened. Her birth, registered in California, raised even more questions. Details were sparse, and the documents that eventually surfaced left room for speculation. Was this a case of parents fiercely guarding their children's privacy, or was there something else at play? It was in this fog of doubt that the seeds of scandal were planted. The perfect image of a royal family forging a new path began to crack. Media outlets reported inconsistencies in timelines, stories that did not align, and a curious reluctance to provide clarity. The public, once enchanted by Harry's charm and Meghan's Hollywood glow, grew restless. They wanted answers, not curated glimpses. And when answers were withheld, suspicion hardened into belief that something was being concealed. The larger issue was that Harry and Meghan were no longer just private individuals. They were representatives of an institution built on public trust. Their choices carried weight beyond personal preference. Every time they defied tradition, the monarchy's critics sharpened their knives, ready to declare the crown obsolete. Every time they withheld details, conspiracy theories multiplied. In this environment, what might have been overlooked in another family became a matter of national, and even global, significance. Harry's defenders argued that his desire for privacy was natural. After all, He had grown up under relentless scrutiny, his every mistake magnified by tabloids eager to sell copies. To shield his children from the same fate was not just understandable, but admirable. Yet critics countered that royals live by different rules. Privacy comes at the cost of accountability, and accountability in matters of lineage is not negotiable. The monarchy, they insisted, was not simply a family. It was an institution intertwined with the nation's identity. And when that institution appeared to be circumvented, people began to question everything. By the end of this chapter, the audience sees a portrait of two people trying desperately to control their narrative, but in doing so, losing control of the trust around them. Harry, once hailed as the most relatable royal, found himself accused of deception. Meghan, once celebrated as a symbol of change, became branded by critics as secretive and manipulative. The perfect image was no longer flawless. It was fractured, and through those fractures, doubt began to seep in. Harry and Meghan's public life after their wedding was always under a magnifying glass, but the lens sharpened even further when Archie was born. For royal watchers, there is nothing more symbolic than the arrival of a new heir. Traditionally, the pomp and transparency surrounding a royal birth are treated as matters of national pride. From the hospital steps appearances to the public announcements placed outside Buckingham Palace, every step of the process serves to assure the public of the child's place in the royal line. But in the case of Archie, the couple made it clear they would do things differently, and that decision would come back to haunt them. When Meghan went into labor, the public expected the familiar rituals. Instead, what unfolded was secrecy so intense that even senior palace staff were caught off guard. Announcements were delayed, details were withheld, and by the time the press received confirmation, Archie was already hours old. The media, accustomed to instant access, revolted. Commentators described the couple's approach as a breach of tradition, a deliberate snub to the very institution that had provided Harry his identity. For the public, the joyous moment quickly soured into a debate about trust. Then came the official documentation. Birth certificates are not usually dissected line by line, but when you are a royal, every comma matters. Observers noticed that Meghan's name, initially written as Rachel Meghan, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex, was later changed to simply Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. The palace explained that this was to align with naming conventions used for Diana decades earlier. Yet the explanation did not satisfy everyone. Why the delay? Why the need for alteration? Critics saw shadows where perhaps there were none, but the damage was done. Once suspicion takes root, it rarely disappears. The couple's next decision only added fuel to the fire. For Lilibet's birth in California, Harry and Meghan opted to keep nearly every detail private. There were no traditional royal statements from London, no grand photos outside a hospital. Instead, they issued carefully crafted press releases on their terms. The name itself, Lilibet, invited scrutiny, as it was deeply personal to Queen Elizabeth. Questions arose over whether the Queen had been consulted or if Harry and Meghan had acted alone. When the official documents surfaced, the choice of informants, the place of filing, and the precise wording became immediate subjects of public debate. Each line was inspected, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. At this point, Harry and Meghan found themselves trapped. Their insistence on privacy, which they believed was their right, clashed with centuries of expectation. Supporters argued that they were modern parents simply trying to shield their children from the spotlight. But detractors saw something far more troubling, a deliberate attempt to obscure facts that should have been transparent. And in the context of a monarchy, obscured facts do not remain private matters. They become constitutional questions. Behind closed doors, palace officials reportedly grew uneasy. While the public was distracted by headlines about Meghan's strained relationships with the press or Harry's legal battles over security, senior courtiers worried about the ripple effects of secrecy. If the documentation of royal children could be questioned, what would stop critics of the monarchy from using those doubts to challenge the legitimacy of the crown itself? Every decision Harry and Meghan made seemed to widen the cracks in their public image, making them look less like the fresh face of modern royalty and more like a couple out of step with the institution they once represented. By now, Harry's reputation as the people's prince was eroding. Where once he had been celebrated for his authenticity and warmth, now he was accused of deceit. social media platforms turned into battlegrounds. Supporters launched campaigns defending the Sussexes' right to raise their children as they saw fit, while critics unleashed a flood of accusations, manipulation, dishonesty, and opportunism. For the first time in years, Harry and Meghan were no longer seen as victims of media intrusion, but as potential architects of their own scandal. The effect on the royal family was profound. William, who had always represented stability, appeared to double down on tradition, ensuring that every detail about his children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, was released in the time-honored fashion. This contrast only deepened the suspicion surrounding Harry and Meghan. To the public eye, William was transparent, while Harry was secretive. In a monarchy that thrives on symbolism, perception becomes reality, and Harry's perceived secrecy looked like guilt. As the cracks widened, even allies began to distance themselves. Friends who once defended the couple to the press chose silence. Media outlets that had once praised their independence began running headlines about dishonesty. What was once a fairy tale now looked like a carefully constructed illusion. And the illusion, under the weight of scrutiny, was beginning to break. This chapter ends with a chilling realization. The perfect image that Harry and Meghan tried so hard to control was no longer theirs to hold. The public had already seen through the cracks, and those cracks were now shaping a narrative far beyond their control. In the world of royalty, perception is as powerful as truth, and once the public doubts your story, every move you make is cast in suspicion. What began as an attempt to shield their children had become the spark that ignited a firestorm. To grasp the magnitude of the scandal that now circles Prince Harry, one must first understand the weight of tradition. Royal births are not private family moments tucked away into dusty records. They are milestones recorded meticulously, often with ceremonial precision, because each birth is not just the arrival of a child, but the continuation of a dynasty. These documents do not merely confirm the time and place of birth. They confirm legitimacy, inheritance, and the right to occupy a position in a monarchy that claims centuries of unbroken lineage. In the history of Britain, royal births have been surrounded by rituals designed to ensure transparency. Centuries ago, it was common for witnesses, including ministers of the crown or high-ranking officials, to be present at the birth of royal heirs. This practice arose from suspicion that infants might be smuggled into palaces to cover infertility or scandal. The monarchy could not afford even the slightest question of legitimacy. Every birth had to be seen, confirmed, and documented beyond doubt. Though such practices faded with time, the principle remained. The records must be beyond reproach. When Queen Elizabeth was born in 1926, the announcement was swift, the records clear. When Prince Charles was born in 1948, the entire country celebrated, and the paperwork was carefully preserved as part of national history. Even Diana's children, William and Harry, had their births recorded with the full expectation that the public had a right to know every detail. The paperwork was routine but sacrosanct, ensuring no one could question their place in the line of succession. Against this backdrop, the births of Archie and Lilibet stand out. It is not that their records did not exist. It is that their release was unusual, their handling atypical, and their details prone to inconsistencies. The secrecy surrounding them was starkly out of place in a system that has thrived on visibility. Instead of following precedent, Harry and Meghan introduced ambiguity. And ambiguity, when it comes to royal lineage, invites doubt. The significance of these documents extends beyond curiosity. They are legal instruments that determine whether a child can inherit not only titles but property, privileges, and even the right to be styled as royal. A forged document, even a small alteration, undermines centuries of legitimacy. This is why investigators were alarmed when reports of tampering surfaced. To the average family, errors in paperwork may be dismissed as clerical mistakes. But for the royal family, they are evidence of something far more sinister, an attack on the very foundation of their institution. The question many ask is why tampering would even be considered. Was it to conceal the exact place of birth, to avoid paparazzi scrutiny, to prevent certain names from appearing in official records? Or was it to fabricate a story, a lineage, that might otherwise be questioned? No one outside the investigation knows for certain, but history tells us that motives for altering royal documents often stem from the desperate need to maintain appearances. In a monarchy, appearances are power. Consider the infamous case of King Edward VIII, who abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. His abdication was not due to paperwork, but the lessons it left behind resonate still. Once the public lost trust in the king's ability to uphold tradition, the throne itself was endangered. Similarly, questions over Queen Elizabeth's uncle, George VI, and his right to reign were tied to legitimacy and duty. In those days, the monarchy survived by acting swiftly and decisively. And today, in the shadow of Harry's scandal, the monarchy faces the same imperative: act fast or risk collapse. When investigators began piecing together Archie and Lilibet's records, the inconsistencies became glaring. Seals that should have been standard looked unusual. The timing of certain filings seemed delayed. Corrections to names and information raised eyebrows. None of this could be easily dismissed. It is one thing for the average citizen to make mistakes in a birth certificate filing. It is another for royals, whose records are handled with extreme care by officials experienced in protocol. The very fact that alterations existed suggested interference at the highest levels. Harry's defenders argue that he, more than anyone, knows the pain of losing privacy. He watched his mother hounded to her death by relentless paparazzi. He had vowed never to let the same fate befall his wife or children. From this perspective, the unusual handling of the documents could be seen not as deception but as protection. Yet the law does not bend for sympathy. If investigators find intent to mislead, the motivations, however emotional, become irrelevant. What matters is whether tampering occurred. The monarchy cannot ignore this. For centuries, the crown has withstood wars, divorces, and scandals because its foundation, the legitimacy of its heirs, remained unquestionable. If Archie and Lilibet's paperwork is proven to be fraudulent, even partially, then their claim to royal titles evaporates. Worse still, the public may begin questioning whether the monarchy itself still holds moral authority. The weight of a nation's trust hangs on the authenticity of these documents. This chapter also forces us to look at the human side of bureaucracy. To many, paperwork is dull, a formality. But in moments like these, it becomes a weapon. Imagine the investigators poring over pages, comparing signatures, analyzing seals. Imagine the hush in the room when a discrepancy is found. Imagine the realization that this was not a simple oversight, but something deliberate. In that moment, history shifts. What was once a quiet piece of paper becomes evidence capable of undoing a prince's reputation. As this chapter draws to a close, one truth becomes clear. The paper trail of royal births is not a relic of the past. It is the cornerstone of trust. It is the line that separates a legitimate heir from a pretender, stability from chaos. And now, that line is blurred. Harry's name, once synonymous with loyalty to his mother's memory and a symbol of the modern monarchy, is tied to a scandal that could redefine how the world views the Windsor family. The paper trail, instead of securing his children's place in history, has become the very chain that threatens to drag him down. Every royal scandal begins the same way, not with official statements, not with confirmed reports, but with whispers. For the British press, whispers are currency. They come from insiders, disgruntled staff, or anonymous sources with just enough credibility to make editors take notice. The story of Harry and Meghan's children was no exception. Long before police investigators began scrutinizing documents, it was journalists and commentators who kept the embers of suspicion alive. They spotted details, magnified inconsistencies, and amplified the faintest rumor until it echoed through households across Britain and beyond. When Archie was born, the initial narrative seemed harmless enough. Harry and Meghan simply wanted privacy. But soon, columnists began asking questions. Why was the birth announcement delayed? Why were even palace staff left out of the loop about where and when Meghan had gone into labor? Why did the couple break from tradition so decisively, refusing the customary photo call? These questions may have started as idle chatter, but they planted seeds of doubt. For newspapers that survive on drama, those seeds grew into stories too tantalizing to ignore. The alterations on Archie's birth certificate became an early lightning rod. Journalists noted that Meghan's name had been removed in favor of her title. Palace spokespeople claimed it was a clerical adjustment, nothing more. But the press thrives on skepticism. Articles appeared questioning whether the change hinted at deeper tensions between Meghan and the institution she had married into. Some headlines suggested the adjustment was made at Meghan's request. Others claimed it was imposed by palace officials. The truth was buried under a mountain of speculation, and the public was left to choose whichever version suited their existing views. By the time Lilibet was born, the atmosphere was even more charged. American outlets covered the birth with glowing features, celebrating the couple's independence from royal control. Yet British tabloids sharpened their knives. They pointed out how little information was available, how distant the Sussexes had become from the structures of tradition. Writers asked, if Harry and Meghan no longer considered themselves working royals, why should their children be afforded royal recognition? These questions were not just speculative. They were provocative, designed to inflame debate and sell copies. Whispers began to morph into accusations. Some columnists claimed unnamed palace insiders were uneasy about the documents filed in California. Others suggested that staff had noticed inconsistencies in paperwork but had been silenced. Rumors swirled of internal conflicts, hushed disagreements, and quiet attempts to keep the matter from reaching the public. Whether these reports were grounded in truth or not, they were enough to capture attention. And once attention is caught, it rarely lets go. Harry and Meghan tried to fight back. Through interviews, documentaries, and carefully orchestrated public appearances, they presented themselves as victims of media intrusion. Meghan, in particular, emphasized the personal toll the press had taken on her mental health. But in doing so, they sometimes contradicted themselves, offering timelines or details that did not match earlier statements. The press latched onto these contradictions like wolves to prey. What might have been dismissed as simple misstatements became evidence, in the eyes of their critics, of deliberate deception. The whispers spread beyond Britain. In the United States, talk shows and gossip magazines debated whether the couple was hiding something. In Europe, media outlets questioned how much longer the monarchy could sustain itself under such scrutiny. Even in Commonwealth nations like Canada and Australia, the scandal became a point of fascination. The Sussexes, once symbols of modernization and progress, were now associated with secrecy and suspicion. At the heart of these whispers lay one devastating question. Were Archie and Lilibet's birth documents authentic? Few journalists dared to make outright accusations, but the insinuations were enough. Words like alleged, claimed, and suspected filled headlines, giving reporters plausible deniability while ensuring the public was left with the impression that something was deeply wrong. In this way, the press wielded enormous power, not to convict, but to condition public opinion, to prepare the ground for outrage should evidence ever surface. And then, as often happens in such stories, one leak turned whispers into a roar. A supposed insider hinted that investigators had begun reviewing documents. No official confirmation existed, but the mere suggestion was enough to ignite headlines around the world. Overnight, what had been rumor took on the shape of truth. News anchors discussed potential legal ramifications, commentators debated Harry's judgment, and hashtags exploded across social media. The whispers had become a chorus, one too loud for the palace to ignore. But silence is a weapon too. The palace's refusal to comment only fueled the narrative. If nothing was amiss, why not issue a strong denial? If the documents were clean, why not publish them openly? Every unanswered question became, in the public's eyes, a confirmation of guilt. This is the paradox of monarchy in the modern world. Secrecy, once a shield, is now a liability. In an age of instant communication, silence speaks louder than words. By the end of this chapter, the press has transformed the story from a family's private choice into a global controversy. What began as whispers about unusual secrecy around royal births has now hardened into public belief that something is terribly wrong. For Harry and Meghan, the damage is already immense. They no longer control the narrative. They are characters in a drama written by newspapers, television panels, and social media feeds. The whispers, amplified and repeated, have become the very foundation of the scandal that will soon erupt into open accusations, investigations, and arrests. Every scandal has a breaking point. For months, whispers had circulated about the strange handling of Archie and Lilibet's births, But whispers alone do not topple reputations. What changed everything was the leak. A single moment when rumor crossed the threshold into alleged evidence, when the veil of secrecy was torn just enough for the world to glimpse what might be hiding behind it. Leaks rarely appear out of thin air. They are orchestrated, intentional, and often timed to cause maximum damage. In this case, it began quietly. An anonymous source contacted a journalist known for digging into royal affairs, claiming to have knowledge of irregularities in official documents. At first, the claim was brushed aside. After all, tabloids are littered with outlandish stories. But then, pieces began to line up. The source mentioned details that matched earlier inconsistencies noted by the press. The journalist pressed further, demanding proof, and what arrived next was explosive. Copies of birth-related documents with markings, corrections, and seals that appeared to have been altered. The authenticity of the leak was immediately debated. Were these genuine state documents, or clever forgeries designed to frame Harry? Experts were called in by media outlets to analyze the seals, the signatures, the formatting. Some argued the documents were consistent with official styles but suspiciously tampered. Others dismissed them as fakes. But in scandals of this magnitude, perception quickly overshadows fact. Once the documents were leaked, the damage was irreversible. News outlets around the world splashed the story across their front pages. Irregularities found in royal birth certificates. One headline read, "Forgery scandal engulfs Prince Harry," screamed another. The internet erupted. Hashtags trended within hours, and millions debated the implications. What did the leak mean for the children? For Harry's reputation? For the monarchy itself? Theories multiplied. Some suggested the couple had altered the documents to keep certain information hidden. Others claimed it was part of a larger conspiracy within the palace itself to discredit Harry and Meghan. The uncertainty only fueled the frenzy. For Harry, the leak was a nightmare realized. He had long warned of the press's ability to twist narratives, but this time the story was not about perception. It was about paperwork. Concrete, physical evidence that could be scrutinized, debated, and potentially weaponized in court. Meghan reportedly reacted with fury, insisting the documents were doctored to frame them. Their allies in the media echoed this line, but the sheer weight of coverage overwhelmed their protests. Once leaked, the documents took on a life of their own. The leak also intensified divisions within the royal family. Inside palace walls, suspicions spread like wildfire. Who had access to the documents? Who had the motive to release them? Fingers pointed in every direction. Some speculated disgruntled staff. Others whispered about senior royals seeking to cut Harry adrift permanently. Whatever the truth, the palace faced a crisis. Their private archives, once considered untouchable, had been breached. And with that breach came a terrifying possibility. What else might leak next? For the investigators, the leak was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it provided new leads, details that could be cross-checked against official records. On the other, it threatened to compromise the integrity of the investigation. Publicly leaked documents tainted the process, raising concerns about chain of custody and media influence. Still, investigators pressed forward. They began calling in handwriting experts, forensic analysts, and state officials who had overseen the paperwork. The scrutiny that had once been confined to press speculation was now an official inquiry. Meanwhile, the public response deepened into outrage. For supporters of Harry and Meghan, the leak was proof that they were being targeted by powerful forces determined to destroy them. For critics, it was confirmation of what they had suspected all along, that the couple had something to hide. Families across Britain debated the story over dinner tables. Talk shows dissected it night after night. International outlets turned it into a global spectacle. The Sussexes were no longer a symbol of freedom from tradition. They were the centerpiece of a scandal shaking one of the oldest institutions in the world. The emotional toll of the leak cannot be understated. For Harry, a man who has lived his entire life under the shadow of public scrutiny, the exposure of his children's private documents cut deeper than any tabloid headline. For Meghan, it was another betrayal in a saga she believed proved her warnings about palace hostility. And for the royal family, it was a wound to their credibility. If something as sacred as birth documents could be tampered with and leaked, what did that say about the security of the monarchy's secrets? This chapter reaches its climax with the moment the leak forces action. Authorities, under pressure from media and public outrage, had no choice but to confirm that an investigation was underway. The palace, still silent, looked complicit to some, guilty to others. And Harry, caught in the storm, faced the horrifying realization that the narrative was slipping entirely out of his hands. The leak had set into motion events that could not be reversed. What had begun as whispers was now a global scandal, and the world was watching, waiting for the next revelation. Once the leak reached the public, what had been whispers and speculation hardened into something more tangible. The British authorities could no longer dismiss the scandal as mere tabloid gossip. The integrity of royal documentation, tied directly to the line of succession, demanded a response. And so, the investigation began, not quietly, not hidden behind closed doors, but under the glare of cameras, with every step scrutinized by a public desperate for answers. The first phase was verification. Officials retrieved the original copies of Archie and Lilibet's documents from government registries and compared them to the versions that had surfaced in the leak. It was a painstaking process. Every seal, every letter of ink, every signature was examined. Experts in document forensics were called in, specialists who could detect whether a mark had been altered, whether ink matched the time period, whether a seal was pressed once or multiple times. They examined paper fibers under microscopes, tested for chemical inconsistencies, and compared handwriting samples against official registrars. Each discovery deepened the storm. Small anomalies, an extra space, a smudge, a date misaligned, were treated as clues in a puzzle that could undo a prince's credibility. As investigators pieced through the records, a troubling pattern emerged. The irregularities were not isolated. Multiple documents bore signs of tampering. Some corrections looked sloppy, others sophisticated. To the untrained eye, they could have passed as harmless mistakes. But to experts, they indicated intent. And intent was the difference between bureaucratic error and criminal forgery. The press reported every development with feverish energy. Headlines screamed of royal forgeries under review. Talk shows invited legal analysts to speculate on the possible consequences. If Harry had knowingly participated in altering these documents, he could face charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. More than that, the legitimacy of his children's place in the royal hierarchy would be at stake. Could two young children be stripped of recognition because of paperwork manipulated by adults? The moral and legal dilemmas intertwined, creating a storm that seemed impossible to contain. Behind the scenes, investigators faced pressure from all sides. The monarchy, desperate to shield itself from scandal, offered limited cooperation. Palace aides were interviewed, some reluctantly, others perhaps too eager to shift blame. Meghan's name surfaced frequently in testimony, though no one could say definitively whether she had played a role. Harry's name, however, appeared again and again. Emails and phone records hinted at his awareness of changes being made. The question investigators struggled with was whether that awareness translated into direct involvement. Meanwhile, Harry's legal team mobilized. Lawyers argued that any irregularities were clerical and blown out of proportion by the press. They pointed to historical precedents where documents had been corrected without controversy. They suggested that the leak itself was evidence of a conspiracy, that their client was being targeted by those within the institution who had long resented his departure. To Harry's supporters, this argument rang true. But to critics, it sounded like desperation. The investigation stretched across borders. Because Lilibet was born in the United States, American authorities were drawn into the case. Federal officials worked with their British counterparts to review California's records, adding an international dimension to the probe. This collaboration only intensified the spectacle. Suddenly, it was not just Britain's monarchy under scrutiny. It was the credibility of two nations' systems, both entwined in a scandal centered on a prince who had once been celebrated for bridging tradition and modernity. Public interest reached fever pitch when rumors spread that investigators had found forged signatures. Registrars whose names appeared on documents denied ever signing them. If true, this was damning. Forged signatures pointed directly to intentional manipulation, and intentional manipulation meant accountability. Every news outlet speculated on the same question. How deep did Harry's knowledge go? Was he a passive observer of errors made by others? Or was he an active participant in a cover-up designed to protect his children's image? For the monarchy, the investigation was devastating regardless of the outcome. If Harry was guilty, the institution faced the humiliation of disowning one of its most visible members. If he was innocent, the monarchy still bore the stain of scandal, proof that its processes were vulnerable to manipulation. Either way, the aura of untouchable dignity that the royal family relied upon was shattered. The middle of this chapter focuses on the human element of the investigation. Picture Harry sitting across from investigators, answering pointed questions under oath. His voice, once commanding in interviews, is now measured, careful, perhaps even defensive. Imagine Meghan, refusing to be silent, issuing statements about her family's persecution, while critics accuse her of playing the victim yet again. Consider the faces of palace aides, torn between loyalty to the crown and the fear of perjury. These moments, though never publicly recorded, became the stuff of speculation, fueling endless debates on talk shows and online forums. As the investigation unfolded, it triggered wider consequences. Politicians raised questions in Parliament about transparency and accountability. Could the monarchy continue to demand respect from the public if its own members were implicated in fraud? Legal scholars debated whether the crown should remain above politics if its credibility could be so easily undermined. The story, once about birth certificates, had evolved into a referendum on the monarchy itself. By the close of this chapter, the atmosphere had shifted from suspicion to inevitability. The investigation had reached a stage where arrest was no longer a matter of if, but when. The authorities had gathered enough to justify action, and Harry knew it. His lawyers prepared for the possibility of custody. Meghan braced for another media onslaught, and the royal family steeled itself for the painful decision it had long feared, whether to stand by Harry or to cut him loose entirely. This is where the scandal transformed into something larger than any individual. It was no longer Harry versus the press, or Meghan versus the palace. It was a question of whether the institution of monarchy could survive the revelation that one of its princes was under criminal investigation. And as the investigators closed their files, preparing for the next dramatic step, the world waited with bated breath for the spectacle to unfold. The investigation had already placed Prince Harry under a microscope, but when evidence pointing directly to him began surfacing, the pressure intensified to a level even he had never experienced before. For years, Harry had endured the harsh glare of the press. He had been criticized for his youthful mistakes, scrutinized for his marriage, and vilified for his decision to step away from royal duties. But this was different. This was not about lifestyle choices or personal feuds. This was about legality, about credibility, about whether a prince had participated in something that could be considered fraud. The stakes were no longer reputational alone, they were criminal. Every new headline seemed to sharpen the blade hanging above him. Did Harry know? Became the central question. Journalists pounced on every detail leaked from the investigation. Television panels debated endlessly whether Harry was complicit or simply negligent. Some commentators insisted that the prince's name appearing on correspondence tied to the birth certificates was proof of awareness. Others argued that Harry, inexperienced in bureaucratic detail, may have relied on aides to manage the process. Yet in the court of public opinion, nuance rarely matters. The perception that Harry was under fire became fact. This period was defined by Harry's silence. Once outspoken, he now avoided public comment, likely on the advice of his legal team. But in the vacuum of his silence, speculation grew louder. Was he hiding because he was guilty? Or was he choosing dignity while the world accused him unfairly? Meghan, by contrast, seemed unable to stay quiet. She issued statements condemning the press and painting the scandal as an orchestrated attack designed to break her family. Her fiery words polarized audiences further. Supporters saw her as a mother defending her children. Critics saw her as manipulative, deflecting blame away from her husband. Harry's allies tried to rally behind him. Friends spoke anonymously to the media, describing him as a devoted father who would never knowingly tamper with documents. Former military colleagues vouched for his integrity, but their words were drowned out by the relentless drumbeat of accusations. When a leaked report suggested investigators had found direct inconsistencies in signatures tied to Harry's paperwork, the conversation shifted from possibility to probability. It was no longer could Harry be involved, but how much did Harry know, and how deep does this go? Inside the royal family, the walls were closing in. William reportedly grew distant, focusing on protecting the image of his own family. Charles, torn between love for his son and duty to the crown, faced agonizing choices. Advisors urged him to take decisive action, to safeguard the monarchy by distancing himself from Harry. To do otherwise, they warned, would risk dragging the institution into disrepute. Harry, once the cherished spare, whose charm brought warmth to the royal image, now looked like a liability. The global media coverage was merciless. Every news cycle dissected Harry's past, connecting dots that may or may not have existed. Old interviews were replayed, analyzed for signs of dishonesty. Clips of Harry speaking about his commitment to honesty and authenticity were juxtaposed against headlines about forgery. The narrative was clear. The prince who had positioned himself as transparent was now accused of deception. Public reaction was divided but fierce. In Britain, polls suggested growing disillusionment with Harry. For many, his actions confirmed long-held suspicions that he had abandoned loyalty to crown and country. In America, reactions were more sympathetic, though even there, commentators began questioning whether Harry's judgment had finally crossed a line. Social media became a battlefield of hashtags, some demanding justice, others demanding mercy. The polarization was intense, and it only added to the sense that Harry was being consumed by forces larger than himself. The emotional toll on Harry was immense. Friends described him as withdrawn, consumed by worry not for himself, but for the future of his children. He had fought to protect Archie and Lilibet from the spotlight, yet now it was the controversy surrounding them that threatened to define their lives. Meghan's anger only added to the pressure, as she reportedly urged Harry to fight back harder while his advisors cautioned restraint. Trapped between competing voices, Harry struggled to find a way forward. The investigation's slow drip of revelations meant Harry could never escape the firestorm. Even when nothing new was reported, speculation filled the void. Paparazzi trailed him relentlessly, capturing images of a man who looked increasingly burdened. Photographs of Harry entering meetings with lawyers became symbolic of his fall from grace, the carefree prince reduced to a defendant in waiting. By the middle of this chapter, the narrative had fully turned against him. Politicians in Britain began weighing in, arguing that no one, not even a prince, should be above the law. Editorials questioned whether Harry had forfeited any claim to royal privilege. Even within the Church of England, murmurs surfaced about the moral implications of the scandal. It was no longer just about forged documents. It was about whether a man once loved by the nation had betrayed it. And yet, there remained a question of motive. Why would Harry risk everything? Analysts debated endlessly. Some suggested he had acted out of desperation to protect his children's legitimacy, fearing that palace insiders would undermine them. Others speculated it was about control, ensuring that he and Meghan dictated the narrative rather than the institution. A darker theory suggested financial motives, tied to the couple's deals and the value of maintaining a pristine public image. Whatever the reason, the motives seemed irrelevant to those calling for accountability. In their eyes, the act itself was unforgivable. As the chapter reaches its climax, Harry stands as a man besieged on all sides, by investigators, by the media, by his own family, and by the weight of expectation. His silence, once a shield, now feels like an admission. His past, once celebrated, now feels like a series of warnings overlooked. And his future, once full of possibility, now feels tethered to the outcome of a scandal that has already consumed him. The world waits for the inevitable next step, but in this moment, one truth is clear. Harry is no longer just under scrutiny. He is under fire. Every decision he makes, every word he speaks, every silence he holds is interpreted through the lens of guilt. And as the flames of scandal rise higher, it becomes harder and harder to see how he can escape without being burned forever. Inside the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace, where portraits of monarchs past gazed down with silent judgment, the royal family faced one of the most excruciating decisions in its long history. Prince Harry, once beloved as the mischievous yet charming spare, was now under the darkest cloud of suspicion. The investigation into the alleged forgery of Archie and Lilibet's birth documents was no longer a matter of gossip, but of legality, and the monarchy was caught in an impossible bind. Should they rally behind Harry in solidarity as family, or cut ties to preserve the institution's credibility? The monarchy has endured centuries by adapting to crises. Abdications, affairs, divorces, even tragedies that once threatened its survival have been weathered through careful management and decisive action. But this scandal was different. It struck at the heart of legitimacy, the one foundation the monarchy cannot afford to compromise. If the public believed that birth documents tied to royal children had been falsified, trust in the crown itself could unravel. And yet, for King Charles, William, and other senior royals, the dilemma was deeply personal. Harry was not just another public figure. He was son, brother, grandson. King Charles found himself at the center of the storm. Having only recently ascended the throne after decades as heir, his reign was supposed to be about stability, continuity, and proving the monarchy's relevance in the modern age. Instead, his own son now risked tainting everything he represented. Advisors pressed him to act quickly, warning that hesitation would look like weakness. Yet Charles, known for his often reflective and emotional approach, wrestled with the weight of fatherhood versus kingship. Could he truly turn his back on Harry, the boy who had once clung to him in grief at Diana's funeral? Prince William's stance was more pragmatic. To him, the crown came first. As heir to the throne, William saw clearly how fragile public support could be. He had built his own image carefully: devoted husband, dutiful father, steady leader. Every contrast with Harry's turbulent life strengthened William's standing. But now, Harry's scandal threatened to drag the entire family down. Behind closed doors, William reportedly pushed for swift and decisive distancing. The monarchy could not afford ambiguity, he argued. Protecting the institution meant drawing a line, even if it meant alienating his brother. Other royals added to the tension. Princess, and, ever pragmatic, sided with William, reminding the family that the crown must endure beyond individual struggles. Camilla, now queen consort, quietly encouraged Charles to protect the monarchy at all costs. Behind the facade of unity, emotions ran high. Old wounds resurfaced. Resentments about Harry and Meghan's departure, bitterness over their interviews, frustration at years of perceived betrayal. These emotions colored the debate, making the decision not just strategic, but deeply personal. The palace press office was thrown into chaos. For decades, the strategy had been to remain silent in the face of scandal, allowing stories to fade. But in the era of 24-hour news cycles and social media, silence no longer sufficed. Every unanswered question became proof of guilt in the public eye. Staff debated whether to issue a statement defending Harry or to prepare the public for a potential distancing. Either choice risked backlash. If they defended him and evidence emerged proving guilt, the monarchy would look complicit. If they abandoned him too soon, they would look cold and cruel. Public opinion added more fuel to the dilemma. Polls showed a sharp divide. Older generations, loyal to tradition, demanded the monarchy cut Harry off entirely. Younger generations, sympathetic to Harry and Meghan's struggles, believed he was being scapegoated. Commonwealth nations watched closely, questioning whether the crown's moral authority was intact. Every path seemed perilous. As the family debated, the emotional toll grew unbearable. Charles reportedly agonized over the choice, torn between the instinct to protect his son and the duty to protect the crown. William, less conflicted, grew frustrated at his father's hesitation, fearing that inaction would destroy what credibility they still held. Even the Queen's memory lingered over the discussions. What would Elizabeth II have done? Some believed she would have acted firmly in defense of the institution. Others believed she would have shown mercy to her grandson. That question haunted every conversation. The family's dilemma extended beyond Harry himself. Archie and Lilibet were innocent children, yet the scandal placed them at the center of a constitutional storm. Should they be denied titles? Should their place in the line of succession be reconsidered? For Charles, denying legitimacy to his grandchildren was almost unthinkable. Yet for the monarchy's survival, some argued it was necessary. The idea of children paying the price for the actions of their parents added another layer of moral complexity. one that tore at the family's emotions even more than the scandal itself. Meanwhile, the press speculated relentlessly about the palace's internal struggle. Leaks from unnamed insiders painted a picture of late-night meetings, raised voices, and bitter disagreements. Was William pressuring Charles? Was Meghan lobbying from the sidelines? Was the crown preparing to exile Harry formally? These stories, whether true or not, deepened the sense that the royal family was fractured beyond repair. In public, the royals carried on with their duties. William and Catherine smiled at engagements. Charles waved for motorcades and attended ceremonies. But beneath the polished exterior, the weight of the scandal loomed. Every handshake, every smile was overshadowed by the question hanging in the air: what will they do about Harry? The chapter builds toward the inevitable realization that the family cannot avoid the decision much longer. The investigation is advancing, the press is unrelenting, and public trust is eroding. The monarchy stands at a crossroads, forced to choose between blood and crown, between compassion and survival. The decision will not only determine Harry's fate, but will shape the monarchy's future. By the end of this chapter, the royal family is left suspended in uncertainty. The dilemma has no easy answer, no path without consequences. To support Harry risks the crown. To abandon him risks the family itself. It is a choice no monarch or heir ever wishes to make, yet it is the choice they can no longer avoid. The news broke on a crisp morning, first as a rumor flashing across social media feeds, then confirmed by breathless anchors on live television. Prince Harry had been taken into custody. It was the moment the whispers, leaks, and investigations had all been building toward. Yet when it happened, the shock was no less earth-shattering. The image of a royal prince, once adored for his charm and humanity, being led away by authorities was not something the public had ever truly believed they would see. It was history in motion, and it sent shockwaves far beyond Britain's borders. The arrest was not carried out in secret. Whether by design or inevitability, cameras were there to capture it. Photographs emerged of Harry, flanked by officers, his expression grim but composed. The clink of restraints, faint but audible in the footage, symbolized more than just a legal procedure. It was the sound of a monarchy's illusion of invulnerability breaking. Crowds gathered outside the police station, some stunned into silence, others shouting their anger or support. For critics of Harry, it was vindication. For supporters, it was heartbreak. For the monarchy, it was catastrophe. The immediate media reaction was electric. Within minutes, rolling news channels replayed the footage endlessly. Headlines screamed across the world: Prince Harry arrested in forgery scandal. Newspapers rushed special editions to print, their front pages filled with Harry's face, the words fraud and arrest in bold letters beneath. Social media platforms exploded. Hashtags trended globally, memes circulated, debates raged in every corner of the internet. The arrest was not just news, it was spectacle. The shockwaves reached the palace instantly. Courtiers scrambled to draft statements, but none came quickly enough to stop the tide. Charles reportedly locked himself in meetings with advisors, his anguish evident as he faced the unthinkable, a reigning monarch's son under criminal custody. William, ever pragmatic, pushed for immediate action to safeguard the crown, his voice one of urgency rather than emotion. Meghan, in California, was said to be furious and devastated, alternating between insisting her husband was innocent and accusing the institution of orchestrating the humiliation. Public reaction revealed the deep divide in how Harry was perceived. In Britain, many saw the arrest as the inevitable consequence of years of defiance and secrecy. Phone-in shows and comment sections filled with voices declaring Harry had finally crossed a line too far. Others, however, argued that the arrest was proof of a vendetta against him, that the establishment had always sought to punish Harry for breaking free and marrying Meghan. The polarization was intense, and it only grew as details trickled out. For the investigation, the arrest marked a turning point. Prosecutors now had to build their case, balancing the immense weight of trying a prince with the demand for fairness under the law. Legal analysts flooded the airwaves, speculating on charges, possible defenses, and the unprecedented spectacle of a royal on trial. Could Harry face prison time? Would the monarchy shield him? Or had the palace already decided to cut him adrift? These questions consumed the public imagination, sparking heated debates about justice, privilege, and equality. Internationally, the arrest was a diplomatic earthquake. In the United States, where Harry and Meghan had built their new life, media coverage was intense. American commentators framed the arrest as a clash between old-world tradition and modern freedom. In Commonwealth nations, leaders were forced to address whether the scandal undermined their relationship with the crown. Even in countries with little interest in monarchy, Harry's arrest was headline news, his global celebrity turning the story into an international obsession. The emotional impact on Harry himself was profound. Those close to him described a man torn between outrage and despair, struggling to reconcile his identity as both a father and a suspect. To the world, he was a disgraced prince. To Archie and Lilibet, he was still their father, and the thought of them one day seeing the images of his arrest weighed heavily on him. This was no longer just about legality. It was about legacy, about what kind of story his children would inherit. The arrest also forced the royal family into the very dilemma they had hoped to avoid. Silence was no longer an option. Public pressure mounted for a statement. When one finally came, it was measured and cold. The monarchy would cooperate fully with authorities and would not interfere in the process of justice. The words were carefully chosen, but their meaning was clear. The crown would not protect Harry. To many, it was confirmation that he had been cast out, disowned in all but name. As the hours turned into days, the shockwaves continued to reverberate. Outside the police station, crowds swelled. Some held signs demanding Harry's release. Others called for him to be stripped of all titles. The media dissected every frame of footage, every detail of his appearance, every word of his lawyers. Late-night talk shows mocked the scandal, while serious commentators warned of constitutional crisis. The arrest had become more than a personal downfall. It was a mirror reflecting the fragility of an institution built on perception and trust. By the end of this chapter, the full weight of the scandal had landed. Harry was no longer simply under investigation. He was under arrest, his fate uncertain, his reputation shredded. The monarchy, shaken to its core, faced the consequences of one of the most humiliating events in its history. And the world, captivated by the spectacle, waited for the next revelation. If Harry's arrest shook the monarchy to its core, the ripple effect placed Meghan Markle in the harshest glare of her life. While Harry sat behind closed doors facing investigators, Meghan found herself standing in front of the world. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, every silence she held became fuel for a media frenzy. The woman who had once been introduced as a breath of fresh air into the royal family was now painted by some as the mastermind, by others as the collateral victim, and by many as the lightning rod for all anger and sympathy. The cameras turned to California. Reporters camped outside her home. Commentators speculated endlessly about her state of mind, and paparazzi zoom lenses tried to capture even the slightest glimpse of her expression. Meghan's reaction mattered because perception mattered, and in this scandal, perception was everything. Would she appear supportive and steadfast, standing by her husband in his darkest hour? Or would she distance herself, portraying herself as a victim of Harry's mistakes and the monarchy's cruelty? Her first public statement came swiftly. In it, she condemned the relentless persecution of her family, insisting that Harry was innocent and that they were being targeted because of their decision to step away from royal life. The language was fiery, unapologetic, and deliberately confrontational. For her supporters, it was exactly what they expected from Meghan: strength in the face of injustice. For her critics, it was proof that she was deflecting, refusing to acknowledge the seriousness of the allegations. Television networks replayed her words on a loop. Experts were invited to analyze her tone, her body language, even the choice of words she used. Was she defiant, or was she panicked? Was her statement an act of loyalty, or a strategy to protect her own image? The debates stretched across continents, with every opinion falling neatly along the polarized lines that had always defined public views of Meghan. As the days passed, Meghan became more than just Harry's wife. She became a central figure in the unfolding drama. Commentators began asking whether she had played any role in the alleged tampering. Did she encourage Harry to take risks to protect their children's privacy? Did she pressure him into decisions that backfired? Or was she herself a victim, dragged into a nightmare not of her making? The speculation was relentless, and with each new theory, Meghan's name trended worldwide. Her appearances added fuel to the fire. When she stepped out in public, cameras captured her wearing dark glasses, her expression unreadable. The photographs circulated instantly, with headlines dissecting her every choice of clothing, hairstyle, or jewelry. When she was photographed without her wedding ring on one outing, the rumor mill exploded. Was she preparing to distance herself from Harry? Days later, when she appeared with the ring back on, the cycle began again. In Meghan's world, even silence was interpreted as strategy. Meanwhile, her supporters in Hollywood rallied. A-list friends released statements defending her, painting the couple as victims of an outdated institution determined to silence them. Activists sympathetic to Meghan's struggles against the British press doubled down, framing the arrest as part of a larger campaign of discrimination. Yet not all her connections stood firm. Some allies grew quiet, unwilling to be dragged into the scandal. Invitations dried up, and whispers emerged of studios reconsidering partnerships with her and Harry's ventures. The spotlight, once a tool she used to amplify her causes, was now scorching, threatening to consume everything she had built. The chapter also delves into Meghan's role as a mother during this crisis. Friends described her as fiercely protective of Archie and Lilibet, shielding them from cameras and ensuring they remained away from the noise. Yet the contradiction was glaring. The very scandal that threatened their father's freedom revolved around the legitimacy of their births. Meghan's maternal instinct to protect her children collided with the brutal reality that their names were plastered across headlines worldwide. For Meghan, the fear was not only about Harry's fate, but about the narrative Archie and Lilibet would inherit. The palace's silence only heightened Meghan's burden. With Charles and William refusing to publicly defend Harry, Meghan became the family's only visible voice. Her interviews, her statements, her appearances became the de facto counter-narrative to the institution's cold silence. Supporters saw bravery. Critics saw opportunism. The truth, as always, was muddied in the glare of media interpretation. By the middle of this chapter, Meghan had become as much a symbol as Harry. To some, she embodied resilience against a centuries-old institution that would rather bury her family than accept their independence. To others, she was the root of the problem, the woman who had lured Harry away from tradition and dragged him into scandal. This dichotomy defined her public image, leaving little room for nuance. As the legal process against Harry gathered momentum, Meghan faced her own private battles. Lawyers prepared her for the possibility of being called as a witness. Advisors urged her to soften her public tone, warning that aggressive statements could backfire. Friends whispered concerns about her health, her stress levels, her ability to cope with the unrelenting pressure. Yet Meghan continued to stand in the spotlight, refusing to disappear, determined to control the narrative no matter how hostile the reception. By the close of this chapter, Meghan stands not just as Harry's partner, but as a central figure in the scandal. Her words shape public opinion, her image defines the counterstory, and her presence fuels both sympathy and anger. Whether she is seen as heroine or villain depends entirely on the lens through which one views her, but one truth is undeniable. Meghan Markle is once again at the center of the world's attention, caught in a spotlight that offers no escape. For all the noise surrounding Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, for all the investigations, accusations, and counterstatements, the most delicate and painful part of the scandal lay in the lives of two innocents, Archie and Lilibet. Though too young to understand the magnitude of what was happening, their very existence had become the epicenter of a crisis shaking the monarchy to its foundations. What should have been the purest symbols of family joy and continuity had instead become the names at the center of debates about legitimacy, forgery, and betrayal. The question was unavoidable. What did this scandal mean for the children? Investigators, in their pursuit of truth, could not ignore that the documents under scrutiny were directly tied to Archie and Lilibet's births. This meant re-examining timelines, hospital records, witness statements, and registry details that most families take for granted. Each discrepancy pulled the children deeper into the storm. For the media, their names became constant headlines. For legal authorities, their paperwork was evidence. For the public, their innocence clashed painfully with the suspicion attached to their origins. The cruelty of the situation was evident. Archie and Lilibet had no voice in this story, yet their names were on every tongue. Commentators debated whether their birth certificates were authentic, whether the circumstances of their arrivals matched the narratives Meghan and Harry had shared, and whether the monarchy should continue to recognize them as royals at all. Strangers online, armed with speculation and fragments of leaked information, dissected their identities with merciless detachment. For Meghan and Harry, this was the deepest wound of all. The knowledge that their children's lives, once so fiercely protected, were now open to the harshest scrutiny imaginable. Behind closed doors, investigators handled the matter with clinical detachment. Teams reviewed medical documents, cross-referenced dates, and examined signatures. They spoke with officials who had been present during the filings, questioning whether irregularities had been noted at the time. Some sources hinted that registrars had raised concerns quietly, only to be told to process the papers without delay. Others suggested pressure had been applied to fast-track filings, creating errors that now looked suspicious. The children's names were not just entries on forms. They were the keys to uncovering who had orchestrated any alleged forgery. The palace faced a dilemma of its own regarding Archie and Lilibet. Historically, royal children have their places and titles secured almost immediately, celebrated with announcements, ceremonies, and photographs. For Archie and Lilibet, the process was different, slower, shrouded in secrecy. That secrecy, once defended as a parental right, now looked incriminating. Senior royals debated privately whether steps should be taken to suspend any claim the children had to titles or succession until the investigation was resolved. Such a move would be unprecedented in modern times and risked public outrage, but so did the idea of allowing doubt to linger. Public discourse about the children grew increasingly heated. In Britain, traditionalists argued that if the documents were proven fraudulent, Archie and Lilibet should be excluded from the line of succession. The monarchy cannot afford shadows, one columnist wrote, encapsulating the sentiment. In the United States, the debate took a different tone, with many commentators expressing outrage that two young children were being treated as pawns in a political and institutional struggle. The contrast between these views highlighted just how global the scandal had become. For Harry and Meghan, the strain of shielding their children intensified. Friends described them as protective, keeping Archie and Lilibet away from cameras, shielding them from schoolyard gossip, and limiting their exposure to news. Yet the irony was unavoidable. The harder they tried to protect their children's privacy, the more the world seemed determined to drag them into the spotlight. Meghan's anguish reportedly deepened as she realized that the one thing she had promised, to protect her children from the kind of media circus that had tormented Harry, was now slipping beyond her control. The chapter also touches on the symbolic weight carried by the children's names. Archie, the first child of a mixed-race duchess in the royal family, had once been hailed as a symbol of modern progress. Lilibet, named after the late Queen Elizabeth's childhood nickname, was presented as a bridge between past and future. Now, both names were invoked with suspicion. Were they rightful heirs or symbols of a deception that cut to the heart of the monarchy? The juxtaposition was stark, and it amplified the scandal's emotional resonance. Legal experts weighed in with chilling clarity. If documents were indeed falsified, the implications for Archie and Lilibet could be severe. Their status as royals could be revoked, their inheritance questioned, their places in history rewritten. Yet even as these discussions filled airwaves and opinion columns, one truth remained undeniable. The children were blameless. They were born into circumstances they did not choose, and it was the actions of adults, whether parents, palace staff, or others, that had placed them in jeopardy. This distinction, however, did little to quiet the storm. By the end of this chapter, the sense of tragedy is unavoidable. Archie and Lilibet, symbols of new beginnings, now represent the collateral damage of a scandal that shows no mercy. They have become questions rather than answers, evidence rather than children. Their futures hang in the balance of investigations, courtrooms, and palace decisions. And for Harry and Meghan, the anguish of seeing their children reduced to names in a controversy may be the harshest punishment of all. The investigation had reached the point where it could no longer be framed as rumor or speculation. With Harry under arrest and the documents under forensic scrutiny, the focus shifted toward the courts. Legal ramifications loomed over not only Harry but also Meghan, the children's status, and even the monarchy itself. This was no longer a scandal for the tabloids. It had become a matter of law, one that carried consequences as severe as prison time, revoked rights, and constitutional instability. The first question the public asked was simple: what charges could Harry face? Forgery of legal documents is a crime in virtually every jurisdiction. In the United Kingdom, altering or falsifying a birth certificate carries serious penalties, including custodial sentences. If investigators could prove Harry was aware of or complicit in tampering with his children's records, he could face charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and perjury. In the United States, where Lilibet's documents were filed, federal statutes against falsification of official records could also come into play. That meant Harry might face legal battles in two countries simultaneously, a nightmare scenario for any defendant, let alone a prince. The potential penalties were staggering. Lawyers explained on news programs that conviction on multiple charges could lead to years behind bars. While few believed Harry would actually be imprisoned for a long period, the mere possibility electrified public debate. Was the justice system willing to treat a prince like any other citizen? Or would his royal status shield him from the harshest consequences? If he were given leniency, critics would cry favoritism. If he were punished severely, others would argue he was being made an example. Either way, the case was a powder keg. The ramifications did not stop with Harry. Meghan's name surfaced repeatedly in discussions about whether she could also face questioning or charges. If she had knowledge of or involvement in the alleged forgery, prosecutors might argue she was complicit. Meghan's defenders insisted she was guilty of nothing more than trying to protect her children. Critics, however, accused her of masterminding the secrecy that had sparked the scandal in the first place. Even if Meghan avoided formal charges, the court of public opinion was already indicting her daily. For the monarchy, the legal implications were existential. The crown had always enjoyed a degree of immunity from scandal through its sheer distance from ordinary law. But this case dragged the royal family into a realm where immunity could not fully protect them. Questions arose in Parliament. If a prince could be accused of forgery, could the monarchy still be trusted to serve as a moral compass? If Harry were convicted, would Archie and Lilibet retain their places in the line of succession, or would Parliament have to intervene? Constitutional scholars debated these questions openly, turning the scandal into a matter of state. The legal process itself became theater. Each court date was marked by flashing cameras, crowds of protesters, and heated commentary. Lawyers debated the admissibility of the leaked documents, with Harry's defense arguing they were tainted evidence and prosecutors insisting they were corroborated by originals. Expert witnesses explained how seals had been altered, how handwriting had been manipulated, and how timelines did not match. For the public, the trial was a spectacle. For Harry, it was the slow dismantling of his credibility. The ramifications extended across the Atlantic. In the United States, debates raged about whether Harry's residency status could be affected. Immigration attorneys explained that a conviction for fraud could complicate his right to remain in the country. Some even suggested deportation was a theoretical possibility if charges in America were upheld. For Meghan, this raised chilling prospects. Could she face raising their children without Harry by her side if he were barred from entering the U.S. or imprisoned abroad? The broader implications were equally sobering. Charitable organizations tied to Harry and Meghan faced scrutiny, with donors questioning whether their contributions had been misused or misrepresented. Corporations that had partnered with the Sussexes reevaluated contracts, wary of being associated with scandal. Every venture, from book deals to media projects, was suddenly in jeopardy. The legal cloud hanging over Harry threatened not just his freedom, but his livelihood. Public reaction to the legal battle was intense. Supporters insisted the charges were exaggerated, a calculated attempt to silence a prince who had dared to challenge the monarchy. Critics demanded the harshest penalties, arguing that no one should be above the law. Politicians weighed in, some calling for calm, others stoking outrage by framing the case as proof the monarchy had outlived its relevance. The ramifications also rippled through Harry's personal relationships. Friends who once stood proudly at his side grew cautious, worried about being called as witnesses. Extended family members kept their distance, some out of loyalty to the crown, others out of fear of entanglement. Even allies in Hollywood, where Harry and Meghan had sought refuge, began to wonder whether continued association would damage their reputations. The couple's once glittering social circle shrank under the shadow of subpoenas and scandal. Perhaps the most painful ramification, however, was the effect on Harry's children. Legal experts debated whether Archie and Lilibet could be stripped of their titles if the documents were proven fraudulent. Would they remain in the line of succession, or would they be removed to protect the monarchy's integrity? For Harry, the thought of his children being branded illegitimate in the eyes of history was unbearable. Yet that was precisely what the law threatened. Not just punishment for him, but erasure for them. By the end of this chapter, the magnitude of the legal ramifications was undeniable. Harry faced the possibility of charges that could destroy his reputation and limit his freedom. Meghan faced the possibility of being drawn into proceedings that would define her in the public eye forever. The monarchy faced a constitutional crisis that could erode its moral foundation. And Archie and Lilibet faced the cruelest consequence of all, the possibility of being remembered not as symbols of renewal, but as the heart of a scandal that shook the crown. If the investigation and Harry's arrest provided the facts, it was the media and the public that transformed those facts into a storm unlike anything the monarchy had faced in generations. Scandal lives and dies by the way it is presented, and in this case, the story was fed into the relentless machinery of 21st century media. Newspapers, television channels, podcasts, influencers, and social platforms all took their turns shaping Harry's downfall into a narrative that consumed the world. The press had always been Harry's nemesis, and now it had found its most powerful weapon. Tabloids splashed his face across front pages with captions that swung between pity and condemnation. Broadsheets published lengthy editorials about the meaning of legitimacy in the monarchy. Television networks ran hour-long specials dissecting the scandal from every angle, bringing in legal experts, historians, psychologists, and even body language analysts to speculate on Harry's state of mind. For every sympathetic commentator who argued Harry was a scapegoat, there were 10 voices branding him reckless, dishonest, or dangerous to the crown. Late-night comedians seized on the story, turning Harry's arrest into monologues that drew laughs from global audiences. Memes circulated online with brutal speed. Some depicted Harry as a fallen prince chained to his own decisions. Others mocked Meghan's public statements, twisting her words into viral punchlines. In the digital age, no scandal remains purely serious. Humor and ridicule became part of the backlash, amplifying the sense that Harry had lost control of his own image. Social media intensified the firestorm. Platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok became battlegrounds. Hashtags trended worldwide, with one camp demanding hashtag justice for Harry and another insisting on hashtag no one above the law. Videos of commentators yelling about the scandal went viral, attracting millions of views in hours. Users posted side-by-side images of Harry as the young boy walking behind his mother's coffin and Harry being led by police officers, framing it as the tragic arc of a man consumed by his choices. Others shared conspiracy theories, weaving elaborate stories about palace insiders setting him up or Meghan masterminding the entire affair. The public backlash was not confined to the internet. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, some protesting against Harry, others demanding transparency from the monarchy. Demonstrators carried signs accusing Harry of betrayal, while others carried placards defending him as a victim of institutional cruelty. The sight of protests about a prince's paperwork scandal underscored how deeply the story had seeped into the public psyche. For businesses, the backlash was swift. Companies that had partnered with Harry and Meghan's ventures quietly began reconsidering their ties. Streaming platforms wondered whether to distance themselves from the couple's projects. Charitable organizations faced difficult choices, worried that association with Harry might undermine their credibility. The backlash was not just personal. It was professional, threatening to dismantle years of work and branding in a matter of weeks. The monarchy itself bore the brunt of criticism too. Commentators asked why the palace had not acted sooner, why inconsistencies had been allowed to fester until they exploded. Critics of the institution saw the scandal as proof of its fragility. Supporters of the monarchy demanded Charles take firmer action, arguing that the survival of the crown depended on drawing a clear line between the institution and Harry. Every delay in response was met with anger, every carefully worded palace statement analyzed for hidden meaning. Perhaps the harshest backlash came from ordinary people who once admired Harry. Letters to newspapers, callers on radio shows, and posts on forums revealed a sense of betrayal. Many had sympathized with his struggles, had defended him against tabloid cruelty, had celebrated his decision to protect his wife and children. But now, confronted with the possibility that he had crossed a legal line, their support turned to disillusionment. They spoke of disappointment, of feeling misled, of losing faith in the man they had once seen as the most relatable royal. The backlash also revealed a generational divide. Older Britons tended to see the scandal as proof that Harry had abandoned his duty. Younger audiences, especially in the US, often framed it as an attack against a man who had dared to challenge tradition. This divide played out in polling numbers, which showed plummeting support for Harry in the UK, but lingering sympathy abroad. The monarchy itself risked alienating parts of its base, no matter how it responded. For Harry and Meghan, the weight of the backlash was suffocating. Friends described them as isolated, surrounded by advisors, but increasingly cut off from the wider world. Every time they tried to counter the narrative, their words were twisted into headlines that deepened the outrage. Every time they remained silent, their absence was framed as guilt. The media left them with no safe path forward, and the public's appetite for the story showed no sign of waning. By the end of this chapter, the scale of the backlash was undeniable. It was no longer about legal charges or investigative details. It was about perception, about a tidal wave of public opinion that could not be stopped. Harry was no longer just a prince under investigation. He was a symbol of betrayal, folly, or victimhood, depending on the lens through which he was viewed. The backlash had transformed his scandal into a cultural earthquake, one that threatened to bury him and everyone connected to him under its weight. The palace had weathered crises before, but none that carried the same corrosive weight as Harry's arrest. Every hour the scandal grew, dragging the monarchy further into the mud. To protect itself, the crown had only one option left: exile. Not the physical exile of banishment to distant lands as in centuries past, but the modern equivalent. Removing Harry from the family's public image, stripping him of remaining privileges, and making it clear to the world that he no longer represented the monarchy in any form. The decision came after weeks of closed-door meetings. Charles, torn between the instinct of a father and the duty of a king, hesitated. He knew what exile meant. It was the symbolic cutting away of his son, a declaration that Harry was no longer part of the institution he had once embodied. Yet William, supported by and in senior advisors, insisted that the monarchy's survival depended on it. Every day of hesitation allowed Harry's scandal to taint the entire family. Silence was complicity, and complicity could topple the fragile trust the crown still held with the people. The announcement, when it came, was brief and devastating. A palace spokesperson confirmed that Harry would no longer hold or use royal titles, that his military honors would be rescinded, and that he and his children would not be recognized with any formal royal privileges until the legal matters were resolved. Though carefully worded, the message was unmistakable. Harry had been cast out. For a family that thrives on symbolism, this was as clear a rupture as exile could be. The impact was immediate. Crowds outside the palace reacted with a mix of relief and sorrow. Some applauded the decision, calling it necessary to preserve the monarchy's dignity. Others wept, seeing it as the final proof that the royal family was broken beyond repair. Newspapers published dramatic front pages, framing Harry as a fallen prince left adrift. Television anchors spoke of history repeating itself, invoking the abdication of Edward VIII nearly a century earlier. The monarchy, it seemed, had once again sacrificed blood for survival. For Harry, the exile was crushing. Though he had once declared his independence from the institution, he had never fully severed his ties. Deep down, he remained the son of a king, the brother of a future monarch. To have that connection severed not by choice, but by decree was a humiliation unlike any other. Friends described him as devastated, his anger at investigators now eclipsed by sorrow at being cast aside by his own family. Meghan, ever defiant, urged him to see it as liberation, proof that they no longer owed loyalty to a system that had betrayed them. But Harry struggled to frame it as freedom. To him, it felt like abandonment. The exile also reshaped the status of his children. Archie and Lilibet, once celebrated as symbols of a modernized royal family, were now left in limbo. Without recognition from the crown, their futures became uncertain. Would they ever reclaim titles? Would history remember them as legitimate royals or as collateral in a scandal too large for them to control? For Meghan, the exile was another betrayal. To her, the punishment of innocent children for the alleged actions of their father was indefensible. Yet for the monarchy, it was unavoidable. Allowing the children to retain royal privileges while their father stood accused would have undermined the very act of distancing. The public reaction to Harry's exile revealed once again the deep divides that had always surrounded him. In Britain, many felt the crown had acted decisively and rightly, cutting away a cancer before it could spread. Others saw cruelty, accusing Charles of sacrificing his son to save the institution. In the United States, sympathy for Harry and Meghan grew stronger. Commentators framed the exile as proof that the monarchy was archaic, incapable of compassion, and obsessed with survival at any cost. The exile also changed the balance of power within the royal family. William emerged stronger, his image burnished as the responsible heir who put duty before emotion. Charles, though bruised by criticism, solidified his reign by demonstrating that he could take decisive action in the face of scandal. For Harry, the contrast was painful. Once he had been the brother who charmed crowds with his humor and warmth. Now he was the outcast, the exile, the cautionary tale of what happens when loyalty to the crown is questioned. Behind the symbolism, practical consequences unfolded. Harry lost his royal residence in Britain. Security privileges once provided by the crown were withdrawn. His ties to military regiments, once a source of deep pride, were formally severed. In one announcement after another, the monarchy erased his presence from its official functions. Invitations to ceremonies, state occasions, and public celebrations no longer included his name. The erasure was as complete as it was swift. And yet, exile did not silence Harry. If anything, it gave him a new platform. With nothing left to lose, he now had the freedom to speak as he wished. Advisors warned the monarchy that pushing Harry into exile might backfire, that a silenced prince could become a dangerous critic. Meghan, ever media-savvy, encouraged him to use his voice. The world waited to see if Harry would retaliate with revelations of his own, perhaps deepening the rift that exile was meant to heal. By the end of this chapter, the enormity of exile had settled over the world. The monarchy had chosen survival over blood, duty over compassion. Harry, once the most beloved of royals, had been reduced to an outsider, stripped of the identity that had defined him since birth. For Archie and Lilibet, the exile cast long shadows over futures they had yet to live. And for the public, the story had shifted from scandal to tragedy. A family torn apart, a crown preserved, and a prince left wandering outside the gates of the institution he once called home. If Harry's arrest and subsequent exile shook Britain to its core, the reverberations across the Atlantic were just as powerful. In the United States, where Harry and Meghan had attempted to build a new life away from the constraints of the monarchy, the scandal unfolded like a drama in which Americans were both spectators and reluctant participants. The couple had invested heavily in their brand as global philanthropists and media figures. They had built their image on independence, authenticity, and the promise of telling their own story. Now, that story had been hijacked by court documents, police footage, and relentless media scrutiny. The American press initially treated the scandal with a mix of fascination and sympathy. Morning shows debated the case with carefully chosen words, framing Harry and Meghan as embattled figures caught in a feud with the monarchy. Celebrities, particularly those in Hollywood who had befriended the couple, released cautious statements of support. Yet as the legal process deepened, the tone shifted. Sympathy began to waver, and a harsher narrative emerged. Had Harry and Meghan traded their royal duties for a new life only to squander it in scandal? American networks aired documentaries dissecting every angle. Footage of Harry in custody ran alongside clips of him and Meghan at glamorous events in California. The contrast was stark. Commentators who had once celebrated them as modern icons now asked whether their ambition had pushed them into dangerous territory. Meghan's speeches about integrity and compassion were replayed in cynical montages, juxtaposed against headlines about forgery and fraud. Hollywood, once a safe haven, grew uneasy. Studios reconsidered projects tied to the couple. Executives whispered about whether Harry and Meghan's brand had become toxic. Invitations to high-profile events dried up. Friends who had once championed them on red carpets and magazine covers became noticeably quiet. The fallout was professional as well as personal. Contracts stalled, collaborations dissolved, and brand deals evaporated under the weight of controversy. The political sphere in America added another layer of complexity. While most politicians avoided direct comment, some used the scandal as a metaphor. Conservative voices argued that Harry's downfall showed the dangers of rejecting tradition for modern ideals. Progressive commentators framed the backlash against Meghan as further proof of systemic bias and an unwillingness to accept change. The couple's story, once framed as a fairy tale of cultural progress, became a case study in division. Public opinion in the United States fractured along familiar lines. Younger audiences, particularly those sympathetic to Meghan's experiences with racism and media intrusion, continued to defend her fiercely. They saw the scandal as yet another attempt by powerful institutions to silence an outspoken woman of color and her husband who dared to challenge the crown. Older audiences, and those less enamored with celebrity culture, expressed skepticism. They questioned whether Harry had been irresponsible, whether Meghan had manipulated public sentiment, and whether the couple's carefully cultivated image was little more than smoke and mirrors. The backlash in America also spilled into their personal lives. Meghan reportedly felt betrayed as allies in Hollywood distanced themselves. Friends described her as determined to hold her head high, yet privately shaken by the collapse of opportunities she had worked tirelessly to build. Harry, for his part, struggled with the dissonance of living in a country that had once embraced him as a fresh face of royalty, but now viewed him with suspicion. The very sanctuary they had chosen to escape the pressures of monarchy was no longer safe from judgment. The fallout extended into their philanthropic ventures as well. Charities tied to their names began facing difficult questions from donors. Could they continue to fund initiatives linked to a family mired in scandal? Would Harry and Meghan's involvement harm rather than help the causes they championed? Some organizations quietly severed ties, while others stood firm, unwilling to abandon projects that had benefited from the couple's visibility. The uncertainty left their foundation, Archewell, in precarious standing. Media figures in America also amplified the divide. Talk show hosts invited panels of experts to debate whether Harry and Meghan had been unfairly targeted or whether they were finally facing accountability. Podcasts dissected every detail of the case, drawing millions of listeners. Social media influencers capitalized on the scandal, creating content that ranged from sympathetic deep dives to mocking skits. For every voice defending the couple, there were 10 more turning their story into viral entertainment. Internationally, the scandal undermined their global standing. In Canada, where they had briefly lived after leaving Britain, newspapers published scathing editorials about their lack of transparency. In Australia, commentators debated whether the monarchy should continue to be associated with a family marked by scandal. Across Europe, coverage turned critical, portraying the couple as symbols of royal recklessness rather than modern progress. The fallout was not contained to one nation or continent, it was global. By the end of this chapter, Harry and Meghan's American dream looked tarnished. The sanctuary they had built on the promise of freedom and independence now felt precarious, undermined by the same scrutiny they had tried to escape. The fallout across the Atlantic revealed a painful truth. Distance from the monarchy did not free them from its shadow. Instead, it amplified the consequences of their choices, placing them at the center of a global reckoning that threatened both their family's future and their legacy. Scandals can be measured in headlines, in polls, in legal filings, but beneath the noise lies a quieter devastation, the toll on human beings caught in the center. For Harry and Meghan, for their children, for the monarchy, And even for those who stood on the periphery of the storm, the human cost of the birth document scandal was immense. It was not simply a question of whether laws had been broken or titles revoked. It was about the breaking down of trust, identity, and the bonds of family. The conclusion of this saga is not found in a court ruling or a palace statement, but in the lingering questions it leaves behind. The scandal forced the world to confront what monarchy means in the modern age. For centuries, the crown has stood as a symbol of stability, its power drawn from tradition and its legitimacy unquestioned. But legitimacy is fragile. It rests on trust, and once trust is broken, it cannot easily be restored. The suspicion that royal records might have been tampered with cracked the very foundation of that trust. For Harry, the journey from beloved prince to disgraced exile is a cautionary tale about the weight of legacy. He tried to build a life beyond the palace gates, but the shadow of his birthright followed him across oceans. His arrest symbolized the brutal reality that no amount of distance could protect him from the obligations and expectations tied to his name. Whether guilty or not, Harry's legacy will forever carry the stain of this scandal. The boy who once represented hope for a modern monarchy is now remembered as the man who nearly tore it apart. For Meghan, the scandal solidified her place as one of the most polarizing figures of her time. Admired by many, vilified by others, she became the lightning rod through which anger at the couple was channeled. Her defiance, her refusal to bow, inspired some and enraged others. Whether she was victim or architect remains a matter of opinion, but her role in the story ensures that her name, too, will always be linked to the controversy. For the children, the cost is perhaps the cruelest. Archie and Lilibet, symbols of new beginnings, have become symbols of doubt. Their future in the line of succession is uncertain, their place in history contested. Though innocent, their names are forever tied to a scandal they did not choose. They will grow up in a world that debates not their personalities or achievements, but their legitimacy. And that shadow will follow them long after the headlines fade. For the monarchy, the scandal was both a threat and a lesson. It reminded the crown that its strength lies not in tradition alone, but in the trust of the people. By exiling Harry, the monarchy sought to preserve itself, to demonstrate that no one, even the son of a king, was above the law. Yet in doing so, it revealed its greatest vulnerability, the fragility of family bonds within an institution built on duty over love. The monarchy survived, as it always does, but it survived scarred, forced once again to prove its relevance in a world less willing to accept its mystique. The public, too, was changed by this story. Once content to view the royal family as distant figures of ceremony, they were reminded that beneath the crowns and palaces are flawed human beings capable of mistakes, deception, and betrayal. The fairy tale of monarchy cracked, revealing the messy truth beneath. For some, the scandal hardened their disillusionment, proof that the institution should be abolished. For others, it deepened their loyalty, proof that the monarchy must hold itself accountable to endure. And so, the story comes full circle. It began with a question whispered in tabloids and kitchens alike. What if the documents were false? It ends with a far greater question. What does legitimacy mean in a world where perception shapes reality? Harry's fall is not just about paperwork. It is about trust, identity, and the devastating cost of secrets in an age where nothing can remain hidden forever. The final takeaway is a sobering one. Families can fracture, institutions can falter, and legacies can be rewritten in the space of a single scandal. The crown endures, but at a price. Harry lives, but as an exile. Meghan fights on, but as a figure divided in public opinion. And Archie and Lilibet grow up under the shadow of questions they never asked for. What do we make of it? Was Harry a desperate father trying to protect his children, or a reckless prince who betrayed the trust of his nation? Was Meghan a loyal wife standing by her husband, or a strategist who played too close to the fire? Was the monarchy justified in its exile, or did it sacrifice compassion for survival? These are the questions left behind, questions that may never have clear answers, but which will echo for years in discussions about the modern royal family. And so the story closes, not with resolution, but with reflection. A prince's arrest, a family's fracture, a monarchy's survival. all woven together into a narrative that speaks to the fragility of power and the enduring human desire for truth. In the end, perhaps that is the real lesson, that no crown, no title, no lineage can protect anyone from the consequences of secrets when they finally come to light. The night was quiet in London, but silence rarely lasts long when it comes to the royal family. The streets outside Buckingham Palace looked calm, but inside the halls of power, whispers had already begun. A question echoed through the press, through living rooms, and across social media feeds. What if everything we thought we knew about Prince Harry's children wasn't true? What if the very documents that certified Archie and Lilibet as part of the royal lineage had been tampered with? And what if those irregularities had now dragged Harry into a storm so massive that it left the monarchy with no choice but to cut him off forever? This is where our story begins, not with celebration or ceremony, but with suspicion. For years, Harry and Meghan had positioned themselves as outsiders to the institution, free from palace control. Their narrative was one of independence, a new chapter, a family breaking old traditions. But independence has its price. In their attempt to protect their privacy and shield their children from the spotlight, a fog of secrecy surrounded Archie and Lilibet's births. That fog, at first, was accepted by some as a natural reaction to media pressure. Yet in time, it became something else, a breeding ground for rumors, questions, and now, allegations of forgery. It all started with something small. An overlooked detail in a certificate, a mismatch in the way information was recorded, oddities that would have gone unnoticed if not for the scrutiny of being royal. Birth certificates are not casual paperwork in the world of monarchies. They are historical documents that trace lineage, inheritance, and legitimacy. They are the threads that tie today's royals back to centuries of history. And when those threads show signs of manipulation, the entire tapestry of legacy begins to fray. Imagine the shock, then, when investigators reportedly stumbled upon inconsistencies too glaring to ignore. Seals that looked reprinted, signatures that did not align with official records, dates that seemed off by a margin impossible to explain away. Suddenly, what had been gossip for tabloids transformed into a case for law enforcement. The whispers became louder, the questions sharper. Who was behind these alterations and why? And most damning of all, was Prince Harry aware? The palace, for its part, responded with silence. There were no grand statements, no public reassurances. That silence was louder than any words could have been, and it fueled the fire. News agencies began to spin the story, each adding layers of tension. Was this a cover-up to hide details of where and when the children were truly born? Was it a desperate attempt to ensure their royal lineage was unquestionable, despite disputes behind the scenes? And if so, who had orchestrated it? This was no longer a question of public relations. This was a legal matter. Forging or tampering with official documents is a crime, regardless of who you are. The idea that a prince, someone who had once been hailed as the people's favorite royal, could be connected to such a scandal was unthinkable. And yet, authorities were moving closer, compelled by evidence that could not be ignored. The very same Harry who had fought for transparency in mental health, who had stood up to the media, now found himself accused of hiding the truth. The middle of this storm is where emotions run high. Harry, the boy who walked behind his mother's coffin, had long tried to define his own identity outside the shadow of the crown. But now his identity as a father was under attack. Every parent understands the instinct to protect their children. Yet, when that instinct collides with the law, with centuries of tradition, and with the trust of a nation, the consequences are devastating. The thought of handcuffs clinking around a prince's wrists was more than symbolic. It was history-shattering. It stripped away the image of untouchable royalty and exposed the humanity and the flaws beneath the crown. The royal family, meanwhile, faced its own crisis. Loyalty to blood versus loyalty to the institution has always been the monarchy's most painful balancing act. King Charles, already managing health struggles and the weight of the crown, could not afford another fracture in the public's trust. Prince William, known for his careful, measured approach, reportedly argued for swift action to preserve the monarchy's reputation. Behind closed doors, the discussions were said to be brutal. Could they continue to stand by Harry if he was truly implicated in something so serious? Or would they have to take the most drastic step imaginable, disowning him, cutting ties completely? For the public, this scandal was more than just another royal headline. It was personal. People who had admired Harry felt betrayed. Others who had long criticized Meghan saw this as vindication. Social media erupted into camps, each side dissecting the story, sharing theories, debating whether this was a witch hunt or a moment of reckoning. Ordinary families, watching from their couches, asked themselves, what would I do if I discovered a loved one had lied about something so fundamental? Would I forgive? Would I turn away? The human element of this scandal resonated beyond the gates of the palace. As the story developed, details grew darker. Reports of secret meetings with lawyers, hushed conversations with aides, Meghan allegedly trying to shield her children from the chaos, while also planning her next move in the media spotlight. Questions about whether the children themselves knew or would one day learn the truth. It was not just Harry's freedom at stake. It was the identity and legacy of Archie and Lilibet. Would they grow up carrying the shadow of this scandal, marked not by their lineage but by controversy? The end of the introduction brings us to the precipice of the story. Imagine the cameras flashing, the sirens wailing, as Harry is taken into custody. The world watches, not believing its eyes, as one of the most famous men on the planet is treated not as a prince, but as a suspect. And as that image burns into the public consciousness, another question rises, heavier than all the rest. Was this truly Harry's doing, or was he merely a scapegoat in a game of power far greater than him? That is where this story will take us. Through whispers and investigations, through royal meetings and courtroom drama, through betrayal and heartbreak. This is not just about birth documents. It is about trust, about identity, about the lengths people will go to protect what matters most. It is about how quickly a royal can fall from grace when the truth, or what looks like the truth, comes crashing down. And by the end, you will be left to decide for yourself. Is this the tragic story of a father fighting for his family, or the shocking downfall of a prince who believed he was untouchable? Harry and Meghan's public life after their wedding was always under a magnifying glass, but the lens sharpened even further when Archie was born. For royal watchers, there is nothing more symbolic than the arrival of a new heir. Traditionally, the pomp and transparency surrounding a royal birth are treated as matters of national pride. From the hospital steps appearances to the public announcements placed outside Buckingham Palace, every step of the process serves to assure the public of the child's place in the royal line. But in the case of Archie, the couple made it clear they would do things differently, and that decision would come back to haunt them. When Meghan went into labor, the public expected the familiar rituals. Instead, what unfolded was secrecy so intense that even senior palace staff were caught off guard. Announcements were delayed, details were withheld, and by the time the press received confirmation, Archie was already hours old. The media, accustomed to instant access, revolted. Commentators described the couple's approach as a breach of tradition, a deliberate snub to the very institution that had provided Harry his identity. For the public, the joyous moment quickly soured into a debate about trust. Then came the official documentation. Birth certificates are not usually dissected line by line, but when you are a royal, every comma matters. Observers noticed that Meghan's name, initially written as Rachel Meghan, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex, was later changed to simply Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Sussex. The palace explained that this was to align with naming conventions used for Diana decades earlier. Yet the explanation did not satisfy everyone. Why the delay? Why the need for alteration? Critics saw shadows where perhaps there were none, but the damage was done. Once suspicion takes root, it rarely disappears. The couple's next decision only added fuel to the fire. For Lilibet's birth in California, Harry and Meghan opted to keep nearly every detail private. There were no traditional royal statements from London, no grand photos outside a hospital. Instead, they issued carefully crafted press releases on their terms. The name itself, Lilibet, invited scrutiny, as it was deeply personal to Queen Elizabeth. Questions arose over whether the Queen had been consulted or if Harry and Meghan had acted alone. When the official documents surfaced, the choice of informants, the place of filing, and the precise wording became immediate subjects of public debate. Each line was inspected, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. At this point, Harry and Meghan found themselves trapped. Their insistence on privacy, which they believed was their right, clashed with centuries of expectation. Supporters argued that they were modern parents simply trying to shield their children from the spotlight. But detractors saw something far more troubling, a deliberate attempt to obscure facts that should have been transparent. And in the context of a monarchy, obscured facts do not remain private matters. They become constitutional questions. To understand how this secrecy turned into a scandal of historic proportions, you have to understand the weight of the paper trail. Royal births are not ordinary events, and their records are not mere forms tucked into filing cabinets. They are public artifacts, part of the national memory, binding heirs to a line that stretches back centuries. In the old days, witnesses attended royal births to ensure legitimacy. Ministers of the crown, senior courtiers, even doctors not directly tied to the family were present to confirm that the baby was indeed born of royal blood. The practice may have faded, but the principle remained the same. Royal births must be beyond doubt. Every certificate, every announcement, every piece of paperwork had to be pristine. That is why the births of Archie and Lilibet stand out like anomalies on a timeline that has otherwise run smoothly for centuries. Their certificates existed, yes, but the way they were handled raised more questions than they answered. The adjustments to Meghan's name on Archie's papers, the delays in announcing the birth itself, the lack of traditional ceremonial transparency. Then came Lilibet's documentation in America, where questions swirled about the timing, the filing, even the name chosen. What might have been harmless eccentricities for an ordinary family became dangerous irregularities for royals. Each inconsistency was a crack in the edifice of legitimacy. And the more investigators looked, the deeper those cracks seemed to run. Seals that did not match other official records. Signatures that bore inconsistencies. Timelines that overlapped in ways that suggested human intervention, not administrative oversight. For experts, this was not a matter of sloppy clerical work. It hinted at intent, and intent is everything. If tampering was proven, it was not just a question of who pressed the pen to paper, but who ordered it, who authorized it, who stood to gain from it. That is why Harry's name surfaced again and again. As father, as duke, as the one who insisted on shielding his family from scrutiny, he was in a position of both motive and opportunity. To his supporters, this made sense. Harry would do anything to protect his children from what he considered an abusive press. To his critics, it was damning. Harry had crossed a line from privacy into deceit. The documents, once a formality, became weapons, legal instruments that could strip Archie and Lilibet of recognition, historical evidence that could stain Harry's legacy forever. And when those documents leaked, redacted copies circulated through journalists and analysts, the storm became unstoppable. This is where the press came in. Whispers had long been the fuel of the tabloid industry, but now they had documents, inconsistencies, expert opinions to amplify. Columnists published speculative essays, connecting dots that may or may not have belonged together. Front pages screamed about royal forgeries, cover-ups, and betrayal within the House of Windsor. Television anchors asked questions with raised eyebrows, leaving audiences to fill in the blanks. At first, these were whispers dressed as headlines. But whispers have power, especially when repeated loudly and often. By the time talk shows invited body language experts to analyze Meghan's expressions or legal specialists to outline the consequences of forgery, the whispers had become accepted as truth in the court of public opinion. The British press thrived on this storm. For years, Harry and Meghan had been painted as rebels, even antagonists to the institution. The secrecy around their children's births fit perfectly into that narrative. American outlets tried to soften the story, framing it as a clash between privacy and tradition, but even across the Atlantic, doubt grew louder. Commonwealth nations picked up the headlines, and suddenly the scandal was no longer confined to the UK. It was global. The monarchy's silence made everything worse. For decades, the royal families never complained, never explained strategy had shielded them from gossip. But in an age of 24-hour news cycles and social media, silence is filled by speculation. Each unanswered question became a confirmation of guilt in the public's mind. Each photograph of Charles or William carrying on with duties was interpreted as either stoic leadership or cold detachment. The whispers turned into a chorus, and the chorus became a roar. By the time a whistleblower hinted that official investigators had opened a file on the documents, the narrative was set. Harry was no longer the prince who had chosen love over duty. He was the man accused of tampering with the very proof of his children's place in history. And this is where the pressure began to suffocate him.